Officially live on Building in Public, today featuring Tyler Angert from Tyler.cafe, among other things. Welcome, Tyler.
Among many things, yeah.
Among many things, yeah. Thanks for
I've
having
gone
me.
a bit of a rabbit hole today looking at all the things like side projects you've been hacking and tweeting about, and I feel like there's so many directions we could go. But I was texting DK like, TK, this is what we talk about all the time. Just like ways of making the internet more like interlinked and like shareable and collaborative, browsing, all of that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's definitely a rabbit hole I end up going down like all the time. It definitely leads itself to that really easily.
Yeah. How did that all get started? I saw that you worked a little bit at the Media Lab and then in education stuff before that. Like, is that when you started thinking about just better ways of piecing apart like browsing experiences and things like that, or did that come later?
I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this. I think like implicitly I've been thinking about it probably since I was like started using the internet. I guess since I was like, a child or like 10 years old roughly. Mainly because like I think I learned like throughout my early childhood and like teenage years that like if I ever wanted to learn something like really well, I wasn't going to be able to do it at school. Like I would have to go back home and spend like 2 or 3 or 4 hours just like by myself, like scouring the web for different things. So I think I always like had this connection to like browsing and finding information that was like linked to just learning things. And now my kind of like prevailing thesis on this is like at any point if somebody wants to like learn something or teach themselves something specifically, it will be required to use like a browser of some sort. Or more specifically, like being able to effectively find things and like browse and go down rabbit holes and like track where you are is kind of like key to learning. And that's like, I didn't necessarily study that specifically during my graduate work or at the Media Lab, but it's always kind of been like an underpinning theme.
So are you taking typically curiosity that gets piqued or stoked outside of the internet, and then you're sort of like going into the browsing experience to learn about it? Because there's also obviously a lot of like curiosity kind of instigation points on the internet itself.
Sorry, can you rephrase the question or repeat it? Sorry.
Yes. So you're talking about sort of how when you want to learn something, you'll turn to a browser. And I wonder, kind of when you're age 10, are most of those things occurring outside of a browser? So they're happening sort of in the real world somehow or in a classroom, and you're turning to the browser as a tool to kind of explore an area? Or I guess over time, maybe many of the instigation points also may be coming on the internet itself or through a browser?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think maybe for me personally, it probably came outside of the internet at first. But obviously now there's like so much that you can just like find that is interesting in itself that's like digitally native. But yeah, I think it's more about like the, I guess maybe if we're looking at it, if we're comparing like the internet to like previous technologies that people used to like learn things, like I view it much more as like a library or like a town square to like, go, like see what's up and, see what people are learning and, what's interesting to digest and stuff. So as far as like how I view it, I don't think it's like better to get inspiration necessarily from the internet or not. Like that's not my claim. I think it's more about like what is the most, I see the browser as probably the most generative tool for like learning things by yourself or learning new things. Just in terms of like where it can take you and who you can find who's like also interested in the things that you're doing. And more specifically, like it's probably, I actually haven't like totally verbalized this like yet or externalized it before. But it's probably interesting to think about the distinction between like the internet as a whole and the browser as a tool that connects to the internet for accomplishing those tasks.
Yeah. How would you sort of draw those lines today?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of talk about like multiplayer generally right now. And like it's not a surprise that like everybody's talking about multiplayer browsing to some degree. But I think it's like, I mean, obviously the internet as a whole is like this enormous thing that you can't really summarize. The browser company for sure. Obviously it's not this thing you can like summarize in a sentence. But I would say it's more like, it's more low level and more like infrastructure-y, I use a lot of like physical analogies to cities. So like if you're looking at a city, I would say that like the internet as a whole kind of feels like highways or roads. And the browser feels more akin to like, a compass or like GPS or something, or at least something that should behave like that. If that makes sense.
That's cool. How does that fit into your thinking behind FreezeFrame and the stuff you're doing there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me think. Well, I mean, the inspiration behind FreezeFrame definitely came from like a little bit of a different origin. Like it wasn't so much focused on like, it wasn't really focused on like social or like the internet as a whole. It was more about just like, I was thinking of it kind of as like a pure HCI, for those who don't know, human-computer interaction project at first. And I was thinking about it with relation to screenshots, actually. But the more I've been using it internally, I actually use it mainly for like browser tabs, because I guess my work happens in the browser anyway. But I view it as like it's like a really helpful recall tool, and specifically, like if we're going back to the city analogy, if like the browser is your compass, I'm trying to think of like an actual tool that like FreezeFrame would be more like, but I think FreezeFrame is more in line with like the compass analogy, where it's like, okay, I remember I'm doing this like set of things, right? Like, oh, I have like Photoshop up and like some notes and like a tutorial I'm following, and like I just want to get there again. So it's really helpful for just like getting into the mindset of a specific thing that I'm doing. So I think with relation to like browsing and the browser, it feels like, especially when people talk about going down rabbit holes or going off on tangents, which I might be doing now.
Those are the best.
Yeah, it feels like the browser also has a responsibility to like direct you to where you're most focused, which I think is a key goal of FreezeFrame.
It's interesting. The FreezeFrame stuff feels to me like it kind of zooms out on another problem that you talk about in a zoom-in perspective, and I think a lot of people talk about in the zoom-in perspective, which is like all of the kind of interstitial notes and information that connects web pages and annotations on a web page. Those are kind of all, in a sense, kind of further, let's say, capillary density of the network. And then the FreezeFrame is kind of like zoom out context kind of across apps, across kind of working context. And I think the zoom in very obviously has kind of shareable spaces, or like there's a notion of how shareability in there would make sense. And I wonder, like, I hadn't really considered this, but in the zoom out world, do you imagine there's like a shareability of that context? Like, could you have Photoshop open with a certain maybe YouTube tutorial video explaining a certain technique you're trying to do? And would that be like a useful context to like share and export into, let somebody else kind of unfreeze in your same context?
Absolutely. I'm really happy. Sorry.
No, that's cool. I'm just thinking out loud. But go ahead.
Yeah. I'm actually so happy you brought this up, because that's kind of like my my vision for this, or at least part of it. Like one day I want to stumble upon like some tutorial on YouTube, and somebody has like a download link to the FreezeFrame for everything that includes like a Photoshop file, like the link to that tutorial, any like notes that they wrote up, like assets or something like on Dropbox or whatever they're using, just as like a package, and I can like recreate everything from there. So there's definitely, from one perspective, you could look at this as like this very isolated magic experience that just lives on your computer, and And then there's another perspective that looks at freeze frames as like, a new file format, or like, a new standard for sharing state across computers. So that's personally what I'm most excited by. Like, I think it's one thing to create Photoshop or something, but it's another thing to create the JPEG. So I think that's like, maybe I'm romanticizing it a little bit, but I think there's a lot of value in creating open standards and new file formats that are like really portable.
Yeah.
So is that how you'd want to do it? You'd want to do it as kind of a file format for collecting state of a local computer? Because I guess you could also take the perspective, I don't know if you follow the work that Mighty is doing with kind of remotable browsers, but you could also imagine kind of, everything's cloud browsing, and then you're just taking and sharing state to those cloud entities. And like, do you think that open standard should work in one way or the other, or kind of applicable to both?
Yeah, that's probably applicable, sorry, to both. In an ideal world, right, like you would have Mighty as like a client of this protocol or something, or like, I actually had one friend of mine who works at Microsoft on the HoloLens team saying how like when she boots up her HoloLens, like there's a million different apps and like files that the HoloLens opens. I'm like, okay, so the HoloLens could be like a FreezeFrame client or something. So I don't think it's necessarily that like this is specific to like local computing and like desktop computing. I think it's more just that like probably most useful there at first.
Right. I was just wondering, from when you talk about kind of a protocol or an open standard perspective, it seems like doing it with all of the haphazard configurations that people may have on their local machines may be, I guess, more challenging than doing it if you were to do it in a fully remoted context. But there might be like competing timelines on which one makes sense to do when and where. I was just curious if you'd sort of had any view on that.
Yeah, totally. That's kind of like there's definitely like a meta comment or like a meta conversation here about like reproducibility and valuing like, personalization and like your own local space versus like sharing that. So I think it's like, I don't have a particularly strong opinion on it yet. But for now we're taking a relatively like neutral approach to like what freezing your desktop actually means and like the level of granularity you get. Like for example, when you're freezing your browser, all it does is save the URLs and the like positions and locations of your windows, right? So it's not like, it's stuff that's like readable by any browser pretty much, as long as you have like a GUI.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of like things you've frozen, or just, we have Screenshare actually, so if you want, you could take us through anything that's like interesting.
Oh yeah, sure. I can let me give a little demo.
That'd be fun. And it is so cool because I was just thinking, as you and DK were talking, like, it's almost the analog of when you're writing something, you look at someone's bibliography if they've written like a good book on a topic, and you use that as your basis for going forward. But this is like the next level of that, where instead of just reading someone's bibliography, what if I could like have all the books they were reading open to the exact point that they were at, like with their notes in them, except for the web?
Yeah. Oh man, I think screen sharing is actually messing up the unfreezing process. So that's how.
Oh no.
I guess. Which I actually hadn't considered that as a potential bug. But anyway, if I could just explain here, I had like, that's actually really funny. Okay, I have a new bug to write down. Need to be able to unfreeze while screen sharing. New edge case, and that was the early alpha version that you saw. So great first demo. But yeah, I mainly like. What's funny about it is that most people talk about, or from the surveys that we did, most people want to use it for like templates for their work. It's, I have my like design setup or I have my writing setup. But I've personally been using it as like kind of a lightweight version of Time Machine. Just like, I want to go back to this point in time. Like, what was I doing yesterday? What was I doing like 2 days ago? or like if I'm so overwhelmed by like however many tabs I have open or like files, or I don't want to think about it. It's just like, cool, I save it, and it's like I don't have to worry about organization.
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally agree that like viewing this, like having insight into like somebody's like operating system level bibliography is a really unique. It's a really unique perspective into somebody's brain.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like the Freeze app, I think one could observe your Tyler.cafe website and say, okay, a bunch of cool hack projects. And it sounds like this is both, a hack project, but also maybe has kind of a longer term that you're thinking about for it. So, just because we talk to a lot of people building new things, I just wonder if you could share some of, how do you think about the process of going from like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if, to having a hack project live, to thinking about, what could this be 10 years later? And how do you think about sort of, I guess graduating up the curve of commitment or seriousness to what you kind of want this to be?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I've thought about this a lot, actually. I think for me, everything starts as just like tiny notes. Just like my notes app is just filled with like I don't use prepositions, like everything, like everything is just like cool if do this, like, so everything starts as like some kind of small like non-committal note. And I actually think I posted on Twitter about this once, but I have this like heuristic that I use basically like if I should actually build something, and it's like if I've written about it 3 or more times, it's probably worth pursuing in some degree. Obviously, that's dependent on like the scope of the project and like how complex it is. If something's really cool, I'm just like, in the like heat of the moment and the inspiration, like I'll just go and make something really quick. But I've learned to like ideas are cheap, like it's easy to have like millions of ideas, like if you're thinking about things constantly. So it's like you really need, for me, just like if ideas pop up again and again, or like if I feel compelled to like write them down again, that's the first step. But then afterwards, it's like the jump from something that's like, a hack or something that's like should be used by other people. That's a whole other thing that like, I still haven't totally figured out. But because realistically, the like FreezeFrame as a project is the only thing that I like have successfully like created some production deployment of that, people are testing, and we have like interest in people being customers. So everything else has just been like hacky or side projects, or just like things for my own personal use, or things to share because they're like artistic or something. So I don't have like a clear heuristic on the second jump.
Was it was it stressful, or were you nervous at all when you were taking something and turning it from just a hack project to letting other people use it when you're gonna, I guess, kind of come out in public as it being a thing people can play with? Was that nervous or exciting or some of each?
Yeah, both for sure. I think for things that I don't intend to be like useful, or things that are more like exploratory computer science projects, like my neighborhood project. I don't know if you've seen.
Yeah, that's kind of like a Conway Game of Life type.
How that came about. That's really cool.
Thanks. Yeah, that project was like, you can play with it. It's live. It's buggy, but it's not like people's lives or people's work is like dependent on like the success of that project, right? Versus like FreezeFrame is incredibly invasive, or maybe invasive is the wrong word, but like it's very intimate and like personal, and we're dealing with like a lot of personal data. Not that we're collecting any of it, but it's like if we lose something or if something doesn't work, or like you're relying on it to like start like a pitch meeting or something, and wait, can I curse?
Yeah, go ahead.
Like if you fuck something up, like it's, like that's on me, and I'm going to feel really bad. I'm sure this is like how people feel with like any kind of creative tool. Like losing people's work is really really bad. So the pressure is much higher on FreezeFrame versus like any of these other things that are just more like, wouldn't it be cool if?
Yeah. And how like what's the interplay between stuff you're doing at Replit versus some of these side projects like FreezeFrame, for example? It seems like Replit is in some ways the perfect environment for all of this like hacky. I don't know. I feel like we had Angert on before, and he himself has such a playful attitude towards building and learning and like playing. So how much of that bleeds into work and vice versa?
Oh, great question. Yeah, they bleed into each other a lot. Is the short answer. The slightly longer answer is that the great thing about working at Replit is that we have the opportunity to answer a lot of like core computing questions, things like multiplayer and like version control, and like larger questions surrounding like collaboration, for example. And these things pop up in lots of different domains, right? So Figma and Notion are dealing with lots of the same collaboration questions that we are, right? We're ultimately dealing with like there's probably some blog post that will come out about this at some point about like universal things that any kinds of media deal with, whether it's like code or audio or video or text or drawing. There's a lot of shared collaboration between all of them. So because of that, some of the projects that I'm working on in Replit end up having a lot of conceptual overlap with like the things I'm dealing with things like FreezeFrame, where it's like, one core question might be like, how should we deal with like history, right? Like, should it be immutable? Should it be just like this, long, like continually growing list of things that, keep adding on to each other that you can't edit? Or should we let people like go back in time and like overwrite things? And it's like, those are the kinds of like core conceptual questions that like I have to answer in both. So I guess technically I'm working like, much more than a regular 40-hour work week. Do
you think of those as kind of application specific, or are they more fundamental to like maybe how collaboration just should work? Like almost, I think more like a law of gravity, or do they actually vary a lot depending on application?
Definitely don't think it's in the same realm of physics, classical mechanics, but I think it's probably closer to like a social science. I think it's like, it's definitely more general overall. Like, for reference, another thing that I really want to solve or like work on like at my time at Replit is like the relationship between async and synchronous collaboration and creating some sort of like unified protocol for that. And I think that like is like everybody has that problem. Everybody has that issue right now. So definitely think it's leaning more towards the general side of not necessarily physics level, but like, it should be, I think it's actually scientific to some degree.
So kind of generalized computing communication kind of tooling.
Yeah. And I think it can be tested. Like that's what I'm getting at with like the social science.
Yeah, it reminds me of our discussion with Molly, and that's how we met you in the first place. So I'm sure you're super familiar with all of the stuff she's been thinking about. But like in terms of also the social layer she talked about, like the more you figure out versioning and kind of showcasing process, and when something is half-baked versus fully baked, like the more almost latitude you have for all sorts of people to feel comfortable kind of contributing to the process of making something and commenting on something, and like almost like gives you the leeway to include a lot more voices than probably have been at the table before things get written or projects get made or things get hacked, which I thought was an interesting layer to it all as well.
Totally. Yeah. That's actually like, I think transparency in the creative process is like a huge part of that in general, because it kind of like exposes, in some ways there's like this, there's a lot of gatekeeping in creative environments, obviously. And like people like to self-aggrandize. and stuff, and be like, my process is so unique, like it's so important. I'm overgeneralizing a lot, but the kinds of people that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And the issue with that is that it like totally it ignores the fact that we have actually so much in common, like between creative fields, or like between anything where you're like you have some sort of like artifact that you're producing, like even if you're a scientist or like a data analyst or something. So I'm actually really excited for tools like Figma just had FigJam that came out. It's like just lowering the barrier to entry for like people to like share their creative process, like regardless of their specific concrete skill sets, is really important, I think. That happens normally in like any kind of, I guess it was more common in like physical meetings when people from different teams would like meet up and stuff, but the digital tooling is catching up to it.
Yeah.
Is the culture around the kind of collaboration around the creative process, is that been changing mostly because of tooling, or are there other like kind of cultural kind of aspects of how creative work gets done today outside of purely like the tooling that enables us to collaborate in different ways?
Yeah.
So if you rewind the clock, I'm saying you mentioned sort of the gatekeepers. You rewind the clock, I don't know, 40, 50 years, and you've got people making TV ads, and that's, it's got a whole ecosystem of gatekeepers and how that stuff gets done. And you couldn't imagine even, how would Notion or Figma fit into that world. But some of it is certainly tooling and collaboration, but I wonder what other kind of cultural things might be moving us there.
Yeah, fantastic question. I think, so they inform each other for sure. Obviously it's not just a tooling thing, it's just like a means to an end in a lot of ways. But, hypothetically, if a tool like lets, 50% or like 100% more people like engage in an activity, you're going to have more diverse voices. You're going to have like more people contributing, and the culture is going to change, right? Like, I think inherently, like if part of your tool is about like expanding access and lowering the floor, that's going to affect culture, because people are culture. So I think that's actually a significant component of it, apart from like just the pure utility part. I also think education is a big part of it, and just like exposing people to different fields in the first place, and like showing people that there are like different career paths they can take, or I don't need to get into like a whole tangent about like education access and technical literacy, but like in general, I think education and like inclusivity into fields is probably the biggest factor that affects something like this.
And when you say sort of inclusivity into fields, do you mean the on-ramps for people who are not in the fields to get their first taste of it? Or is there something else kind of inclusivity? Is it something broader outside of kind of, I guess, new accessibility of creative tools as on-ramps?
Yeah, I think that's one part of it. It's like accessibility of tools. It's like I'm imagining this like huge graph of like all these different nodes that are like, affecting each other. There's obviously like, like racial and gender biases that like the whole computing industry is like still dealing with, among other industries. There's like education access, and whether or not like computer science, for example, is like a like standard subject. I know we're talking about collaboration generally, but like in terms of like technical literacy and like digital tools, there's also like the just generally speaking, right? Like I think when sorry if I'm stumbling over my words a little bit.
That's right.
Thinking out loud.
Just think of this as a chance to form the way that you would want to say it in the future. You don't have to get it perfect this time.
We're all just jamming,
We'll just jam, and then we'll make a highlight of the way that you like the best.
Cool. Yeah, live TV. It's a wild time.
That's right.
Yeah, I think it's Yeah, apart from like the access of tools themselves, and like, you know, whether or not people have laptops that can actually like run the software that you're using to collaborate remotely. You know, there's like, I think generally any kind of barrier that you can identify that prevents like, you know, a certain group of people or like a certain individual from like participating in the conversation is something that ultimately like affects the culture around collaboration.
Right.
Yeah, it's like we all talk about, like, it's really hot to talk about collaboration from a very, very tool-centric perspective. But the thing that people forget is that it's like about people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we probably need to do a much better job of addressing like the social circumstances, the environmental factors that go into like why people aren't collaborating so well.
I wonder if you mentioned sort of the tangents you've thought around the education system. I wonder if you could wave a magic wand if there are some like core ideas that you'd like to get out in the world around if we could shift this system from looking this way to looking that way instead. You know, are there a few kind of core ideas that you've been, you know, even if they're only half formed, but you've kind of been noodling on around, you know, how to create more inclusivity and how to sort of, in a sense, I think sometimes it's letting people know that it's okay and that it's like, it's fine to work on this kind of thing, and it could be a respectable career, it could be a respectable, or it doesn't even need to be called respectable. It can be like a thing that you're okay with. Everybody's okay with you trying these kinds of things. But I wonder, are there like any core like cultural changes that you could imagine if you could wave a magic wand? What would you want to see happen?
Yeah. This is the kind of thing where like the video is going to end, right? And I'm going to be like, oh man, I should have said this.
Sorry, we can plant the seed, maybe come back in 20 minutes.
Exactly. But the thing that's coming to mind is like just having people recognize that they can be creative. I think there's like, if I were to wave a magic wand, like you said, and like, you know, suddenly I can instill like a single cultural value in like everyone across the world. The thing that frustrates me the most is like people who say like, oh, I'm not creative, right? And it's like because they have like, you know, a bad grade in art class, like in the fourth
right
or something. And I'm like, that's so silly. Like I totally get you probably feel that way. But like, I think understanding that creativity is like a super multifaceted, like multimodal skill, and that it can be applied in domains like outside of art, right? You know, that's obviously like the field that takes the most attention because that's how you're like introduced to creativity as a concept when you're a kid. So I think first, like having people understand that they can be creative is like the first thing that I want to instill. And then jumping off of that, I'm definitely a big proponent of constructionism, which is a learning theory, like an educational psych theory, popularized by Seymour Papert. But it, like, the TLDR for it is basically like learn through building, like make things of your own, experiment and play, and your knowledge of the world is basically constructed like through your act of building. And it almost sounds obvious, like from all the advice that you hear online, like, oh, like learn through building, like build a project. But it's like, it's a really effective learning tool that I don't think people recognize can be applied to things like outside of like code directly, right? Like writing a short story, or like, you know, even if you want to learn cooking, right? Like try creating your own recipe, or don't go by the book necessarily. So there are ways it can be applied. And I think it's super useful.
Yeah. Right. Are there people whose creative process you think you've learned particularly a lot from? Has that been a big part of your learning, like peeling back and going deep on process with other examples of people that you're seeing, even though it's like a little bit harder to do now than ideally will be in the future with kinds of the things you're building? But how have you thought about that?
Yeah. I think the people that come to mind are Zach Lieberman, for the most part, who is a artist, a professor, He does a lot of. I actually have one of his prints on my wall. Shout out to Zach.
Oh, cool.
But he posts like these daily sketches of him just like he's the author of this this creative coding framework called Open Frameworks, and he just posts like constantly, just like really focusing on like daily sketches and like putting things out there and not worrying too much about like the completeness of things. And I really appreciate that a lot because it's like I read some anecdote somewhere that just like focusing on like frequency and like quantity is actually more important for learning and more important for learning than like, you know, working on one thing like really, really consistently. You know, don't have data. This is all anecdotal, but, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But like, I think especially if you grow up with some kind of artistic background or like, you know, you grow up admiring crafts that end up with like really, really polished artifacts, right? Like I used to want to be an architect, for example. So I'd like look at these amazing skyscrapers and I'm like, how do you build a skyscraper? You know, it probably takes so long. Like how many, you know, you're like, I had this vision of like, you know, hiding in a studio, just like working on it for like 2 years until it's finally done. And then like you start reading about, on the contrary, you start reading about like startup culture and like just getting things out there and like testing it right away. So I think a mixture of like people I've seen from the startup community who really focus on just pushing things out quickly and like testing them instead of getting like, you know, their egos attached to the quality of their work has been really important for me.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. She's got a screen share.
I was just pulling up his Instagram, like so cool. Just, I mean, imagine pushing yourself to, oh, this is annoying. But like pushing yourself to do this regularly and just like getting stuff out. I totally agree.
Yeah. He posts more on Twitter, I think. I don't know. But just
one of the things, you know, I think you mentioned sort of almost wanting to help people understand that they can be creative. And one of the things that we hope that this show, Building in Public, can do is help people see what the creative process looks like from the earliest days. So I think we sort of have a shared hope for the world in that sense that, you know, let's imagine fast forward, you know, the world 10 years from now. And, you know, everybody in the world is using, you know, Freeze app. And now that, you know, that 10-year-old kid who's thinking about getting into a coding project can actually see what it looked like when Tyler was just starting to explore this idea, and it was quite uncertain and shaky still. And now he knows sort of where it can go and sort of what humble beginnings it has. So that's part of why we like doing these. We hope that, you know, in the future it can inspire people when they see sort of big things get made from small beginnings.
Yeah. And also the fact that like that never really ends, but I don't think people have much, like whoever's drafting the skyscraper probably also has massive creative blocks and is just like banging their head on the wall or whatever, but no one thinks about that either. So I think just like more, as you said, more transparency into the creative process overall, I think would hopefully help unlock a lot of participation. It also reminds me of like I used to take creative writing classes, and like I asked Joyce Carol Oates was teaching one seminar, and I took a seminar with her, and I was like, so what should we do? Like, because she was pretty positive about people's stories and stuff, and she was like, just keep writing more. Like, no one does that. I'm successful because I literally write a lot every day, and then like some of it is good. And it's so true. Like, if you actually think about how much am I producing or building every day, I feel like for most people it's probably like not much, because you get overwhelmed with the thought of like making something big.
For sure. Yeah. That actually, I was also going to shout out my middle school art teacher, Miss Helsley, because she gave me very similar advice. And I remember when I was like 12 or 13 years old, I asked her, I was like, you know, how can I get into this? Like, I was obsessed with this, it's called the Cooper Union, which is like an architecture and art school. I was like, I want to go there one day. How can I get there? And she's like, you should probably sketch every day. You should probably like, I wake up at like 5:30 in the morning and Like I do my daily sketch and then I start my day. And I'm like, okay. It's one of those like tough pills to swallow. That's like, the basic boring stuff works. Just like do things consistently, and you'll probably get pretty good at it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's like the flip side of that coin is like toxic hustle culture and like do this every day, blah blah blah. Like you're not allowed to have a day off. So it's trying to find a balance.
How have you found people in that process? Because I feel like that's a key unlock too. Like having people that are also like very just real, curious, hacking on different things, like especially online. I'm sure you haven't even like met all the people you might interact with on Twitter and stuff like that. But what's been your process of like finding a community of other creative people online?
Oh man, I wouldn't say that I have a particular process. I think I'm probably just getting better at like sniffing out people who are actually cool and interesting. I think it's hard to articulate, but it's pretty easy to tell when people are just like posting things or working on certain things for like, clout or for attention, versus people who are actually like, really into what they're doing. And I wish I could share my like insights into like how I determined that, but it's very much like, internal sixth sense, I guess. But I've really just been, like, I think personally, like my online presence, I try to just post things that I'm like into and post things that I'm working on without like thought into how polished it is. Obviously I really like posting polished work that I've been working on for a long time, but the really insightful conversations come from when I just like post random shit that's like, I don't know if this is a good idea or not, like who has thoughts, who's been thinking about this,
right?
Or like asking like, oh, what's the state of the art in this, right? Like in a field that I don't have anything or any idea about, right? And I know that I have friends online that are much more knowledgeable than me in that field. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to engage with the people who actually know their shit, and I'm not just like out here pretending that I have good opinions. So I think probably engaging with people who are better than you at something is probably a key component of that.
Yeah.
And how do you think about the kind of, I guess, divergent versus convergent work? Like, do you silo those as certain activities or modes? Well, because I feel like there's a lot of times, if people are gathering and spending a lot of time on Twitter, you end up kind of, some people call it kind of an echo chamber or a filter bubble. You end up with like some commonalities of ideas, which can be helpful for understanding people deeper, sometimes kind of finding a tribe, kind of, finding the collective of people that you might want to work with. But I think actually a lot of the interesting stuff sometimes comes when you're kind of out in left field and you're sort of in more divergent areas and you're not following the kind of the well understood mimetic common things that are being discussed. And I wonder, sort of, do you actively seek out different, do you have different modes of operation, or do you sort of, how do you kind of balance the divergent and convergent types of activities in the creative process?
I've never thought about this before. You can probably see the a little bit. I would say that probably to my disadvantage, actually, I don't separate them, and I end up just distracted most of the time. Like, I think I'm constantly, like last night, for example, I like, had a few hours to spare, and I was just like, I'm going to learn everything about graphics programming right now. And I was like jumping between tutorials, like just asking friends different questions, like, why am I so dumb? I have no idea how this works. And I didn't really get anywhere. I was kind of just spinning my wheels for like 3 hours. But the value in that is that you end up like, I guess the more technical term for that is like I was doing more of like a breadth first search of like what I didn't know and like trying to like, gain some familiarity with the territory that I was in. So I think when I'm first starting out trying to learn something, or, if I'm interested in something new, I really try to like identify my biggest weak points and also like my biggest areas of curiosity at first, which usually overlap pretty significantly. So I think the most divergent part is usually at the beginning. And then like as I hone in and like find stuff that like, you know, I can grasp onto that like isn't too far out of my reach. There's a tangent here about the zone of proximal development that I think about a lot. I'll link it. Some education school stuff right now. But that's cool. Like probably the most useful for when I'm first starting out and I'm really just trying to like gain a feel for like, is this too hard for me right now? Is this like actually something that's cool or is it like a facade? But then the more convergent stuff. And I think let me clarify, like when you said convergent and divergent, it sounds like you're talking mainly about like how wacky or out there the ideas are versus like how commonly accepted or like mimetic you said there. Is that right?
I guess like when I think about you know, some of the topics that we've discussed around kind of browsers and interlinking and annotation, these are ideas that I think, you know, the three of us and many of our friends on the internet are very excited about and interested in. And so in a sense, you know, I think they are genuinely interesting topics, so I would not avoid them, but they're also things that like the people that I hang out with and discuss with a lot do have an opinion and care about and think about and do want to talk about a lot. And I think about like, you know, are there ways to inject other things that are just not from that? Like if you took like I'm no expert on the Civil War, but I bet if I started down some path there, I'd find something that really piqued my interest in some story that kind of sounded a little crazy and then gets me kind of hooked on some new line of thinking that like nobody on Twitter is talking about the Civil War, at least not in my group. I'm sure somebody is, but in my group, that's not like a topic really right now. So I wonder, like, are there ways to, you know, take those, you know, force yourself into these more like, you know, side paths or, you know, things that sort of get you out of the comfort zone of what your collective kind of is already excited about.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm understanding the question a little bit more clearly. It's actually funny you mentioned this because like probably a year ago, I had an idea for a YouTube channel called Between Fields. And the idea would be that you had like, you know, the Wheel of Fortune?
Yeah.
You have like two wheels of fortunes that you would both spin and it would just be each item would be like a different field or like, you know, some subject, like biology, computer science, fashion, whatever, like, you know, just random shit.
Wow.
And you'd spin both of them. And the idea was that like, whatever two the wheels landed on, I would like build a project that involved both of them or something.
That's so cool.
I love that.
I never got around to doing it, as most of my ideas die in notes. I think it's really useful to do stuff like that, and like, you know, deliberately be divergent just for the sake of like I think novelty in itself is something worth seeking, actually. And seeking things that are novel, like novelty has a lot of like downstream effects, right? It's just like, it's new, it's exciting. It can like make you think in different ways. And it's just fun, right? Like it's fun to just think of things that like people aren't discussing right now. And at the same time, like, you know, whatever you discover, doing these like more wacky things, right? Like, I don't know, the Civil War and like biology. I keep bringing up biology, but like, it's a good forcing function to do stuff that's interesting. You know, like you can take those learnings and like bring them back to the conversations that you're having with your friends. So I think it's like, I wouldn't say I have a particular strategy, like you asked, like around when I do this and like when I go back and work on the things that everybody's talking about. I think it's like things that are divergent are just like fun a lot of the times, and they're shiny, and it's easy to engage with them because they're novel. And I think just like being opportunistic about things that are really fun and engaging probably has disproportionate payoff to, you know, the conversations that you can bring back to everybody else.
Yeah. that's sort of I sometimes miss about like a academic campus in a way, because you can just run into someone. I mean, they are their own bubbles in a lot of ways, but the ability to run into someone who's like spent 30 years like researching one species of frog in Costa Rica or something, and like having a conversation with them, that's sometimes harder to get that. I mean, they're there on the internet, but just to like, am I going to set a time every day that I'm like random rabbit hole, like Wikipedia random article or something, like find the expert kind of thing. But I mean, I think like ways of kind of like thoughtfully ingesting or injecting that into one's creative routine could be really valuable.
Right. Now you're making me think of a kind of tool that I would like. So imagine that we could. So I think we have like enough shared context and know enough of the same kinds of things that we're like curious in very similar directions, at least on some set of things. But I wonder if it would be cool if we could, if I think if I just went out, if I had just just clicking on the random feature of Wikipedia feels like I would kind of be like, okay, yeah, I mean, sure, I'd run into cool stuff, but I almost wonder if we could collectively like co-browse into randomness together and then sort of all react real time to what we're bumping into. And if I think because we have enough shared context and understanding on what we are interested in, if you sort of like inject some piece of randomness into, and then we sort of are all kind of collectively commenting and discussing kind of what, are we intrigued on this random thing, or keep going because nothing really got me. And then if we kind of bookmark it, and like the ones that maybe we go through a dozen or 2 dozen of them, and the ones that I'm really intrigued by may not be all the same ones that you are, but we sort of at least know the temperature of the room on what other things are exciting to people, and then we can bring back some of our thinking on that. Is this something you've already built?
Internet Browsing Club, yes. I was just going to say that. That would be so cool.
Yeah. I even made like I quote tweeted myself. I made a logo for it too.
Oh my gosh.
It's not really a tool, right? But like the spirit is there.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
For what it's worth.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
I was on a website this morning. I forget how I bumped into it, but Garrett Camp, do you know, who works on a kind of accelerator thing called Expa or incubator thing? They're working on a tool called Mix, which looks like it's some sort of reimagination of the Stumble Upon. I don't know if you've ever played with Stumble Upon back in the day, but it kind of looks like it's Stumble Upon redone in kind of a video-centric format. And it started to get me kind of thinking about that concept anyway.
Very fun. Yeah, I'll have to check it out. Stumble Upon was amazing.
Yeah. I feel like we need more of those like little, rabbit holes for us to sort of, I guess we hadn't really talked about exploring them together until I guess your tweet mentions that, but ways to sort of get outside of our tracks collectively into some new tracks and then see what sticks.
Yeah. That would be really cool. You could all decide like let's learn about like the zone of proximal development, or like something that maybe someone knows a little bit about but wants to get deeper into, or maybe it's something that like neither of the three know about, and then screen share it. Like, and this could be even cooler with like freeze frames. What are each of you? How are each of you learning about this? Like, what are all the rabbit holes, and like what's the end of that 1 hour kind of like hack learning session?
Yeah. The interesting thing about these kinds of questions is like, a lot of them are, some of the core problems here are just purely social. Obviously there's a lot of problems involved with this, right? Like, how do we like share state? Like, right, should we like be syncing scrolling state and stuff, or like very granular technical and design decisions, versus like, you could test whether or not people actually want to do this by just doing something like I posted, right, where you're just on your own browsers together, but you're just video chatting and talking about where you want to go.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, like trying to pick apart the different problems in that domain and seeing like which are like dependent on good tooling and which can be like kind of hacked together with like just like a video chat and a browser.
Yeah, definitely. Did you ever try an internet browsing club, or not yet?
I've tried twice. Both were not great. It was. I think there's a lot to work on with the format for sure. It was also like my first time working with what's called like OBS or like any of the streaming software, and I was like, this is like impossible to use.
Right.
Oh yeah.
But I found that like this is the times where I have the most fun with stuff like that is when I'm just like catching up with a friend that I haven't seen in a while, and we're just like FaceTiming on my computer, and inevitably we end up sending each other like links that we've read, and we start like reading and talking about it, versus like going into it with like a lot of structure.
Yeah.
And like feeling like we have to start here, we have to talk about this is like, I tried it with one of my best friends from home once, and we like started with some tweet, and we ended up just playing GeoGuessr for like 30 minutes. Which, for those who don't know, GeoGuessr is a game where you're basically just dropped onto a random location in Google, and you have to like guess on the map where it is.
That is epic.
I have gone on multi-hour rabbit holes of this with like friends over. I remember we once hosted like a dinner party at our house. We had like, I don't know, a dozen people over. Then we went and sat down in front of a big TV and did GeoGuessr, where we were all like shouting things at the TV. No, I think it's that. I think it's that. So it's such an amazing party game.
For sure.
I mean, before like this was building in public, DK and I would just, and actually like I learned a lot through doing this. I think we should do this more every now and then. But like we would literally just like paste an article into Google Docs and screen share it, like read it at the same time, and spend like 2 hours just sharing Twitter links and stuff and seeing what came out of that whole process. So I think, yeah, there's something to it, but definitely figuring out the mix of like how much is predetermined and how much is organic, and like, I don't know, the whole like social element of it for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I think the larger commentary here is around just social computing, and you know, what does presence mean between devices and between computers? Because like it's easy to, or not, it's not even easy, but it's already a challenge to like answer this with reference to just like one experience, right? Like the browser.
Right.
But I think people are like reaching towards, people want to connect with each other like in more than just like, you know, the internet way. So the grander challenge is just like, you know, hypothetically, if you were to redesign a computer from the ground up, but make it social, right? Like what would that look like? Or, you know, if you look at any operating system, the primitives are all like files and folders, and, you know, you build apps on top of them. But what if like, and this has been explored in different ways already, but like what if people were a primitive, right, on your computer? So I think it's useful to like throw up like total reconstruction framings like that.
Yeah, totally. And I know we're coming close to the hour, and DK and I always like to wrap by asking people just like, what are you curious about? What rabbit holes are you falling into? And so I know we talked a lot about that today, but I was going to ask you like what's been on your notes app recently? Like what are the newest kind of like little ideas that have been popping up?
Yeah, let me pull it out. Definitely, the biggest one is probably graphics programming, and just like graphics in general, and like biological simulations, and like having them. I'm like running into these things that I want to make that like you can't just do with like traditional programming languages. So I'm like, it's a huge challenge, but that's just really interesting to me. I'm gonna plug somebody's work. Sage Jensen is their name. Let me post, but they're super inspirational. They just make absolutely insane work, so I highly recommend it. The other thing that I've been thinking about is this. I'm calling them photospheres. I haven't made them yet, but I had this idea of like, you know, what if you're like looking around like through your camera and you see just like this like little ball, right? That like is basically like a moment in time that you can step into, and like not only how do you step into it, but like if you were to like just record like a moment in time, right, that you could like step into, not just a video, but like it kind of had persistence in the real world, what would that like recording experience be like? So I'm thinking a lot about like the relationship between photography and like memory and you know, time and space, and I could get really, I could go off the bend with that, but that's for another time.
That's so cool. Yeah. Oh my gosh, I feel like we have like 7 follow-up sessions we could do.
I know, right?
If we want to do an internet browsing together, I would definitely be down at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. We should book something.
Cool.
Yeah. Cool.
It's been so much fun. Thanks so much for spending the time with us, Tyler. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank both of you so much. Awesome. This was amazing.
Cool. All right. See ya.
Cool. We'll talk to you soon.
See ya.